Welcome to our Friday video. So wrapping up our chapter, we're talking about how perfect competition, although it's kind of a benchmark, it's not what we actually believe. Most products in the US are sold in perfectly competitive markets. It's useful for us to think about and talk about and how firms act within those. We're going to wrap up that chapter by talking about the efficiency implications of perfectly competitive markets. So if we have profit maximizing firms, now again, all of these things are based on assumptions, right? So there are firms out there that care about stuff beyond their profits. So, I mean, to take an extreme example, a nonprofit is a firm, right? A nonprofit for our purposes is an organization that makes and sells stuff, at least in many cases. Maybe services, or it may be goods that are sold in a nonprofit sense. So obviously a nonprofit is not trying to maximize profit, but they are acting as if they were in many ways. So they care about their mission, whatever that mission is. But to achieve that mission, they need to have resources. And so they need people putting in hours, whether they're volunteer or paid. They need money to be able to do the stuff they want to do. And if you look at something like a nonprofit hospital, and it really acts a lot like a for-profit hospital in the way it charges clients, in the way that it pays its doctors. So using this simplification that firms are maximizing profit, it does a pretty good job to us of explaining what's going on. Now, we talked earlier about how consumers maximize utility. And utility is kind of this squishy concept that it's hard for us to pin down, but it's useful because it does a good job describing what people actually want to do, the choices people actually make. So maximizing utility means you pick the choices that are best for you, that you're most satisfied with, that you think will bring you the most happiness in those circumstances. And so we look at what people put in their shopping cart and we say, yeah, that's what made them the happiest, not because it's what they wanted to buy. They may have wanted the really expensive blue cheese salad dressing, but they got the cheap blue cheese salad dressing because it was cheaper and they have a budget constraint, right? But so we think about these two simplifying assumptions. Firms are trying to maximize profit. Consumers are trying to maximize utility. And in a perfectly competitive market, so we have a large number of firms selling essentially identical products. And we can think about bushels of wheat or corn as being a pretty good example of something that's like a perfectly competitive market. With those conditions in place, we can say that we have two different kinds of efficiency. So the first is called productive efficiency. So think of productive production. We're talking about the firm side here. We're making goods and services and at the cheapest possible cost. So we are minimizing our costs and we're actually selling them to consumers at that cost. So if you recall, in the long run, we talk about how the marginal cost curve, it's intersecting our long run average cost curve at the lowest point on the long run average cost curve. And the price, long run, we expect to actually adjust with downward pressure. If prices are higher than that, there's positive profits and firms want to enter this market. If the price is below that, there's upward pressure because firms are exiting that market. And so long run, equilibrium, we expect the market price to be equal to the long run average cost, which is the lowest possible cost of making this thing. So that's productive efficiency. We're making stuff as efficiently as we can, as cheaply as we can, using as few resources as possible. And we're actually selling them to consumers at that low price, a price that is equal to the cost, the long run cost of making them. Now, the other type of efficiency we see in a market like this is allocative efficiency. So that means that we're allocating things in a way that makes people as happy as possible. So here you can think of the consumer side. What are people choosing? Well, we've said they're maximizing their utility. They're picking the stuff that makes them happiest. And so they're going to do that in a way that ends up being best for society, if we think of best for society as being what makes people as happy as possible, kind of. So a perfectly competitive market with profit maximizing firms and utility maximizing consumers has really nice efficiency features. We're making stuff as cheaply as possible. We're passing those goods on to consumers at the lowest long run price possible. And they're picking what things those are, what products are being bought and sold in a way that makes people as happy as possible. So that's good news. You may not care about firms making big profits, or you may not care about people being able to buy fancy watches. That's fine. I'm not asking you to. But you should still think about this idea of productive and allocative efficiency as being kind of good things, as being targets that we aim toward, because it means we're making the right stuff and we're making it with as few resources as possible. And that means we can put more resources toward other stuff. And depending on what you believe in, that could mean more fancy watches, or that could mean more environmental quality or more social justice. So there are lots of things that we need resources for, and if we're being efficient with the resources we have, it means we can do more of that other stuff. Even if we may disagree on what that other stuff may be, use that as the motivation for why efficiency is good. Productive efficiency means we're making stuff with as few resources as possible. Allocative efficiency means that we're spreading things out. We're making the right stuff to make people happy, essentially. Now, it gets more complicated than that. The big caveats we'll finish this with. We already talked about how perfect competition doesn't actually describe the markets for most of the things that we buy. So maybe a bushel of corn is a perfectly competitive market, basically, but a cereal box is not, a car is not, an internet service is not. Like, these are not perfectly competitive markets. So the market assumption is not quite right for most of the stuff that we buy and sell. There are also caveats about, like we mentioned, firms care about more than profits. People may not think about maximizing utility, but they usually act as if they do in a pretty good way, but we have behavioral economics to talk about deviations from that. Even with all of those acknowledged, there are reasons why markets don't lead to efficient outcomes all the time. So even if you have a perfectly competitive market with profit maximizing firms, with utility maximizing consumers who act in rational ways, there are still things called market failures that mean that we end up at outcomes that aren't efficient. And so I study environmental economics. We think about market failures a lot. There are things called externalities associated with pollution. So things like pollution can kind of mess up. We can end up in the wrong spot if we're not factoring in things like that. There's also issues about people having all the information they need to make the right choices, whether that's firms or consumers. And so there can be information asymmetries. There are other classes of market failures that mean we don't always end up at what is actually the efficient outcome, even if some of our assumptions about what's motivating people and how markets are structured, even if those hold, we still have things to worry about. So we'll talk a little bit more about that going forward. But I bring it up largely as an acknowledgement. Like we said in class earlier this week, all models are wrong. The point of a model is to simplify things so you can focus on some important aspects of it and say things about that. But it's a simplification. That's what makes it useful. But so it's not totally accurate. And so it's important to remember that these models are based on assumptions, and they're not gonna be accurate for a lot of different things. Hopefully they're useful and reasonably accurate for certain things. And if those things are important, that's why we use models all the time in economics. But it's important to acknowledge that they're not everything. They don't get everything right. So I mean, we've seen that with election stuff, right? There are models predicting who is going to win the election in different states and what the margins would be, largely based on polling. Those models may have been useful. They're, of course, not perfectly accurate. The actual election outcome is quite different from what the prediction models were saying. That's why we actually have the election, right? Because we don't just rely on a prediction model. We have the election because that's what matters. That's what decides things like who's going to take a political office. So that's the world we're in, and we'll continue next week. I hope everyone has a enjoyable and safe weekend.